How many people were here last night when okay, so most of you were here. We're going to elongate and elaborate and whatnot, what we've discussed. We may repeat some of it. How many people were not here last night? All right. How many of you are foodies? How many really work a lot of your life around your food? That's a better question. Yes. And how many of you conscientiously try to avoid eating genetically engineered foods? All right, now I want to make it harder for you. I want to ask you to rate yourself from 1 to 100 how vigilant you've been at avoiding GMOs in the last few months, including going out to eat, including eating at other people's places, as well as shopping. So give yourself one number. 1 means, what's a GMO? Or on the scale of 1 to 100, the average American is about -7. And 100 is extremely vigilant, as much as you can do. So how many people are in the lowest category of 1 to 20? Raise your hand. All right, thank you. Look around. Just put your hands up again. We're looking around. This is a pre-test for the whole audience, okay? All right, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 100. All right, so around 40 to 100, it's evenly spread. And less in the 0 to 20 or 20 to 40. And that's unusual, because usually it's skewed towards the bottom. Now rate yourself from 1 to 100 how active you are at talking about GMOs, telling others, educating people. And 1 means not at all, 100 means extremely. So how many people are at low levels of active? 1 to 20, raise your hand. 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 100. All right? Very similar. So we're going to see how you feel about GMOs in terms of your self-rating number going forward in about 45 minutes. Now, there were enough of you that are avoiding GMOs sufficiently to ask this question. Raise your hand if, when you started avoiding GMOs, you noticed some improvement in your health. Raise your hand and keep it up, please. Look around. Okay, so there's a substantial number here. All right, some improvement in the health. So let's hear, if you care to share, a symptom that you noticed improved or disappeared. Yes? Inflammation. General inflammation. A specific inflammation? How is that?
Hands and shoulders.
Aha. So pain, swelling? Swelling, okay. Inflammation, it's interesting. Let's take a look at inflammation here. Inflammation is an immune system reaction. Actually, we're going to get to that in a minute. I'm going to add some more together, and I'm going to explain why GMOs may be related to that. Okay, another one.
I agree with her, but for me, I can taste things with pesticides on them, and they make me sick.
So when they say they make you sick, is that nausea?
The taste.
Oh, the taste, you taste things with pesticide and it makes you sick. So it's kind of a, yeah, okay. All right. You had another one? Yes. Lack of clarity. What were we talking about? Lack of clarity. I have heard brain fog in most of the lectures where I ask this question. So how many others have noticed a improvement in the clarity? Okay. There's many hands up. Okay. Anyone else? Inflammation. I see several. Okay. What's another symptom? Less headaches. I hear that very often. How many people reduce headaches? Okay, several hands. Another one. Yes. Allergy symptoms. I've heard that in every single group I've asked except one. How many others with allergy? Okay, about, I see 5 or so, 6. Yeah. Autoimmune skin condition. So it's both, it's like a skin rashes and things like that? When you eat good food, the autoimmune disease or condition on your skin goes away. I have heard skin conditions over and over again. It's one of the most common results where people describe getting better when they get rid of GMOs. Anyone else with skin? Okay, I was surprised when I started asking that question. I heard that so often. Any others? I'm waiting for the most popular. Yeah? constipation, or GI tract issues. Thank you very much. Let's give her a hand. You weren't expecting to be applauded for that, were you? So yes, GI tract disorders are always present in every audience I speak to. How many people notice an improvement in digestion, GI tract disorders? Okay, so I think it's the most popular here too, given the numbers. And it's always the most popular. It's always the most popular. Anything else before we go on? Fatigue. Very, very popular. Fatigue. How many people notice an improvement in energy? Okay. Anything else? All right. This is typical. I'll give you some stories of what I've heard that haven't come up today. I was at MIT giving a talk to staff, faculty, and I asked, has anyone gotten rid of GMOs and noticed a health improvement? A woman's hand just shot up. She said, my 6.5-year-old son was violent and out of control. They wanted to kick him out of school. She told me later they wanted to call him retarded and kick him out of school. And she said, I saw your movie, Genetic Roulette, The Gamble of Our Lives, and I immediately took him off of all GM foods. She said, all the problems disappeared. I said, how long did it take before you noticed the change? He said, 1 week, but within a month, I had a new son. Another person wrote that her son was being suggested that he be held back a year, and he had asthma, got rid of the GMOs, no more asthma, top of the class. I've heard of parents of autistic kids at the movie Genetic Roulette. We have 3 of them, describing improvements in behavior. I had a 63-year-old man come up to me at a lecture afterwards and said, I have autism, and if it weren't for you, I could not be here. Because when I heard you, I got rid of the GMOs in my diet, and now I can be with other people for the first time. I had a woman tell me that her son has allergic reactions to a particular ingredient, and a line forms around his mouth, a dark purplish line that stays there for weeks, and he's had to stay out of school a lot. She saw the film Genetic Roulette, took the kids off of GMOs, and a couple of months later, her son has an exposure. It was a faint line with hardly any other symptoms. I hear this over and over again. And actually, it's exciting to hear it, but it's also a pressure, because I think I've heard more testimonies than anyone on the planet. So I'm anxious to get it out so everyone can benefit from the information that's coming to me. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, how do you know that it's the elimination of GMOs that caused the problem? What do you do when you want to avoid GMOs? What do you do? Read labels? Buy organic? Don't buy anything in a box? Okay, so if you are buying organic and eliminating processed foods, how do you know if it's the non-GMO component of your new diet that's causing you to have greater mind clarity, energy, and better health, or whether it's the reduction of other chemicals that are used in conventional, or the elimination of all these additives or coloring agents, etc., that are found in processed foods? When you look at livestock who have removed GMOs, and I said this last night, they turn out to have the same types of improvements that humans do, and there's no cofactors. They're just removing the GM soy or corn and putting in the non-GM soy or corn, and we see, the pigs getting rid of diarrhea, the humans getting rid of irritable bowel, the pigs eliminating the need for as many medicines and antibiotics, humans talking about better immune system. When the American Academy of Environmental Medicine looked at the animal feeding studies, they saw gastrointestinal problems, immune system problems, accelerated aging, organ damage, reproductive disorders, dysfunctional regulation of cholesterol and insulin. Said all doctors should prescribe non-GMO diets to all patients. And now there are thousands of doctors doing just that. Now, I mentioned last night that in addition to the reported improvements in humans and animals, including pets, and the afflictions in lab animals, we see evidence in the trends in the United States. So let's take a look at those. This is deaths from senile dementia, and it's tracked with the use of glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. Okay? So you can see as the use of Roundup goes up, this is correlational. We can't necessarily say it's a cause, but we'll look into the characteristics of Roundup and see why this may be related. This is deaths from Parkinson's, and this is both GE corn and soy use in the United States and Roundup. This is diabetes. This is the trend line of where diabetes used to be before these were introduced. And this is where the trend line is removed. So if you take out the trend, this is the change that happened to be when glyphosate and soy and corn were planted in high numbers in the U.S. This is acute kidney injury. This is end-stage renal disease, kidney failure. This is kidney and pelvis cancer incidence. This is thyroid cancer. This is liver and bile duct cancer. And these are the locations where glyphosate concentrates in the areas where there is an increase in cancers in the United States. Hepatitis C, liver problems. High blood pressure. Autism, dramatically lined up. This is low birth weight babies. Inflammatory bowel. Chronic constipation. Death due to intestinal infection. Peritonitis, a gastrointestinal disorder. Obesity. Rheumatoid arthritis. And this is incidence of celiac disease corresponding to the introduction of GMO canola. This is celiac disease in an Alberta hospital, which is where they planted a lot of GM canola, which is Roundup Ready, among others. Those are some of the correlations. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at how GMOs might be causing these problems. Now, there's good news at the end. So, this is an interesting weekend. There's a lot of intense information. So we're going to take each other's hands, not really, take a deep breath and step into the section of my talk which I call Death, Disease, Destruction, and Despair. Don't leave in the middle, you'll be very depressed. At the end, I'm going to describe to you some very good news in much more detail than last night, and also what we can do about it. It turns out we're having an incredible impact on the whole GMO scenario, and part of it is because we have been able to document this information, share it with millions of people, and you'll see how that makes you feel and how that changes your attitudes today, and how we can have that in much higher numbers working together. So, GMO. Does anyone not know what a GMO is? Probably I should have asked that earlier. Let's say you want to create a corn plant that produces its own toxic insecticide. So you take a live living bacterium called Bt, or Bacillus thuringiensis, that produces its own toxin called Bt toxin. The toxin pokes little holes in the cell walls of insects to kill them. You take the gene from that bacterium and you make millions of copies. And you put it into a gene gun. And you shoot that gun into a plate of millions of cells, corn cells, hoping that some of those genes make it into the DNA of some of those cells. Then you clone those cells into a corn plant. Now, every single gene, every single cell of the corn plant contains a gene-sized spray bottle that produces Bt toxin. The process of insertion, whether done by gene gun or bacterial infection, plus cloning, creates massive collateral damage in the DNA. 2 to 4% of the DNA is different, mostly mutated, because of the process of insertion plus cloning. It was pointed out by someone at our table today that 2 to 4% change in the DNA, that's significant. And we talked about it, and on his inspiration, I looked it up on Google. Chimpanzees have 98% of the DNA as humans. So 2 to 4% difference in the genome is significant. What it means practically is genes create RNA, create proteins, so the changes can increase the amount of proteins or decrease the amount of proteins or shut off genes or turn on silent genes. And this is ignored largely by the biotech industry and the regulators. So in the Bt corn that Monsanto sells, they never checked to look at all the changes in the DNA, in the RNA, in the proteins, in all the metabolic pieces that end up there that are created from that process. They never looked. So an independent scientist looked at the proteome, all the changes in the proteins. They found 43 proteins that were dramatically increased or decreased or shut down or turned on in Monsanto's Bt corn that Monsanto didn't know about, that no one knew about. It was already on the market. One of those changes was a gene that's normally silent in corn that was switched on that produces something called gamazine, which is a known allergen. So there is an allergen in that corn that some people may be reacting to, some people may be dying from, that's not labeled, that was never known, that was ignored. The authors of that study said, interestingly, there's this new allergen. It was only interesting that there was a potentially deadly new protein in corn already released onto the market and being fed to billions of people. But a major concern to them was that there were some proteins there that had been truncated and had completely different shapes. When you change the shape of a protein, it can go from harmless to deadly. In Monsanto's soybeans, they found a known allergen called trypsin inhibitor, which is normally denatured or broken down in the heating process, was not broken down so much in the heating process and ended up to be as much as 7 times higher in the GM soybeans after cooking compared to the non-GM soybeans after cooking. They left that information out. They found it and ignored it and kept it out of their published study. It was discovered later and made public. I spoke recently to the regulators of Australia and New Zealand who approved GMOs. And these women were boldly announcing that they had been approving GMOs, some cases, since 1996. And I described what I just told you. Thousands of doctors prescribing non-GMO diets, livestock changes, pet changes, collateral damage in the DNA, unpredicted, unevaluated. None of that was important to them. For all the human experience, it was just pushed to the side and said, anecdotal. For the others, they said, well, selective breeding also causes changes. Selective breeding also causes potential problems, and because that causes potential problems, we don't have to look at the potential problems that GMOs cause. It's crazy Completely illogical. And the basis of regulation of GMOs in Australia and New Zealand. So when you have all of those changes that you can't tell in advance, because you don't know if it's going to create a new toxin, something that has never existed before in the crop, maybe in the food supply, you wouldn't know it by even doing a proteome analysis. In fact, I said to them, why don't you require the complete genome to be sequenced of all the GMOs, and the RNA, and all the proteins, and the metabolome? Let's get all the information. And their response was, no, we don't want to collect the data because we wouldn't know how to interpret it. So this is the logic. Because we don't have enough data collected in order to evaluate changes, let's not start. Let's not start building up a database of information that could have ultimately saved people's lives, because it might be misinterpreted now. So this is their scientific thinking. Now, if you don't do the genome and the proteome and all that, if you don't do that, how do you know if you've created a new disease or new toxin or new carcinogen unless you've tested? And even if you tested, you won't know if it's what it is in some cases. The only way, according to some, is to actually feed it to animals long term and see what happens. So I asked them about long-term or any type of animal feeding study, and they said, we don't require it. We don't require animal feeding studies. And I said, why not? And they said, because sometimes animal feeding studies don't show you problems that exist. They'll miss the problems. And I said, yes, that's true. Sometimes if you do an animal feeding study, a problem will not reveal itself. But there is a body of literature that shows that animal feeding studies do show up problems all the time that are never evaluated in just the composition of a crop. They didn't care. This is their mindset, dictated by the biotech industry to the regulators. So the regulators think they're doing a good job. In Australia a few years ago, I went to one of the regulators and I said, in India, animals grazing on the Bt cotton plants are dying. Thousands and thousands of them. I went to one village where they allowed buffalo to graze on cotton plants after harvest for 8 years. They allowed buffalo to graze on the GM cotton plants for a single day, and all 13 buffalo died. They also lost 26 goats and sheep. On top of that, people handling the Bt cotton are getting allergic reactions. They're getting rashes. They're getting upper respiratory issues. I said, have you investigated into that? Are you going to investigate? The regulator said, India is not our jurisdiction. I said, it's the same plants you plant here. Later on primetime television with the head of the Australian FDA, I challenged him and he went, I'm sure we're doing a good job. Now, all of what I've described in terms of Australia and New Zealand, actually, let me just do a couple more, because this is my favorite. I have a weird, I'm an investigator, so it's like, oh, good, I found something. It's like, I like the drama. There was a scientist who I write about in Seeds of Deception who was fired and stripped of responsibilities and forced out, and he was horribly treated. And I wrote it all about, first chapter, Arpad Pustai, and then I finished the chapter and it was going to go to press soon, and I read somewhere that he had been robbed, burglarized, and his notes had been stolen from his house. So I called him up and said, Arpad, you had a burglary. Someone stole your notes. He goes, yeah. Why didn't you tell me? This is great news. So I look for these type of shocking moments. So Monsanto submitted a proposal to Australia and New Zealand regulators for high lysine corn. Corn that has a gene inserted from soil that produces a lysine for pigs. So you don't have to feed the pigs corn plus a lysine supplement. They do all this so that they can patent it, sell it for more money, and save people the cost of buying lysine to add it to the pig feed. So this is their big save the world technology. So they said to the regulators, don't worry about the protein. The protein produced by the inserted gene, it's found in soil. We eat soil, part of residues of fruits and vegetables. No need to worry. It has a history of safe use in the food supply. So Professor Jack Heinemann from New Zealand calculated how much corn an average American male would eat per day. And if that were high lysine corn from Monsanto, how much of that protein would be ingested? And then he calculated how much of that protein is found in the soil. And then, logically, how much soil we would have to eat each day for an equivalent amount. The amount of soil an average male American would have to eat every single day. 22,000 pounds per second. Back up the trucks. 22,000 pounds per second, 24/7, but you don't have to worry. It's safe use in the food supply. Now, what I just described, and the Australian New Zealand regulators say, bring it on, no problem. What I just described in terms of Australian New Zealand regulators turns out, tragically, to be better than the FDA. The FDA, I wish there were a perfect way I could say, the Federal Death Administration. There's some way to say FDA. But the enforcement wing of Monsanto, their attitude is this. Fraud and Death Administration. Thank you. Fraud and Death Administration. The person who was in charge of FDA policy in 1992, when the GMO policy was created, was Michael Taylor. Michael Taylor was Monsanto's attorney. Later, Monsanto's chief lobbyist and vice president, now put back at the FDA by Obama as the U.S. Food Safety Czar. Michael Taylor was given the position of, in 1991, as the Deputy Commissioner for Policy because the FDA had been told by the White House, promote biotechnology. So they created that position for him. He had worked with Monsanto as well as a council of GMO companies beforehand to create the ideal regulatory framework to fast-track GMOs. And then he was put into the position of government, apparently, to implement it himself. The policy at the FDA is no testing is necessary. The policy at the FDA is that Monsanto, the largest GMO producer, can determine on their own whether their GMOs are safe. They can declare their products generally recognized as safe and put it on the market without telling the FDA, and because there's no labeling, without telling consumers. So Monsanto, who told us that PCBs, Agent Orange, DDT were safe and got that wrong, they're in charge of food safety in the United States.